All right. Welcome, everyone, to a final episode of TradeView Live for 2025, our last episode of the year. I'm your host, Ben Tracy here. I lead strategic business development at Vizion, joined here by our other host, Kyle Henderson, CEO and co-founder. Well, it's the last episode of the year, and we had to do something special. And so we'll start with our special guest, joined here by Santosh, managing partner at Dynamo Ventures. Santosh, why don't you say hello to the crowd?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to folks. I'm Santosh, co-founder and managing partner here at Dynamo Ventures. Have had the good fortune now of being on the journey with the team at Vizion for 5 years, if I remember correctly, Kyle. And have equally been able to kind of see this vision unfold. No pun intended. But I think we now live in a day and age where there's more data, dare I say also alternative data in and around global trade, in part due to all of the hard work you both and the others at Vizion have done. And excited to kind of dig in and I guess most importantly, look into this proverbial crystal ball we're staring into today to see what might happen next year.
Yeah, Santosh is revealing his role on today's episode. 2 weeks ago, we recapped all of 2025 with some of the highlights, some of the biggest trends that we've seen, highlighting specific industries and countries that were impacted. But today we're going to look forward. We have Santosh as our oracle of sorts to help us with some predictions for 2026, what we think is going to be happening. Before we do that, let's do our typical disclaimers and introductions to some of the words and the data that we'll be showing. Kyle, why don't we, for any new audience members, let them know what is TradeView?
It is not financial advice. Just to get that disclaimer out of the way up front. TradeView is the industry-leading trade intelligence platform. We have the benefit of being able to ingest nearly 60% of all ocean freight bookings worldwide. We use that to forecast what's going to happen across the trade network in great detail, profile companies, profile products, networks, etc. And we've dumped AI researching capabilities on top of all this. So there are answers at your fingertips in TradeView, which we like to illustrate with TradeView sessions such as this, where we pull lots of great data and insights and share them with you, the audience at large. And again, that question pops up of where does the data come from? Well, aside from ocean bookings, we plugged into 270 plus different data sources worldwide. And this allows us to have an amazing insight into how freight is moving in great detail. Freight that is in an ocean container, that is. And how can you forecast the future? Well, because they're bookings, we see bookings turn into actual shipments, and then we see shipments play out over several weeks. So we're able to forecast arrivals in great detail with great accuracy, looking 12 weeks into the future. Something we've been doing and putting into this presentation for the better part of this year, and have had, I would think, greater than 90% accuracy for all of our forecasts, especially for U.S. arrivals, port by port. So that's what TradeView is. That's what TradeView Live is, and that's how we do what we do. Ben?
Well, thank you, Kyle. And before we get into some of the predictions for 2026 and want to hear from Santosh, why don't we recap just since the last time that we met? I think we had just been looking at the week of November 24th as the most recent week's worth of bookings. So obviously we've had 2 weeks transpire since then. We've had lots of things going on in the news that could be impacting booking trends. And we've seen some changes. We've seen some changes really in all three of these views, not just for China to US or US import bookings, but let's start with global bookings. Kyle, it looks like we've seen a bit of a drop in the last week.
Yeah, just a 6-7% drop week over week for global bookings being placed. You know, part of this can be we're certainly past the peak of the peak season at this point, being that the holiday here in the U.S. is only about a little over a week away. And aside from that on the global stage, there's not really much more to point to, just a bit of a reduction week over week.
Yeah, and it looks like we were actually initially showing growth from a global perspective of all bookings being placed, and we're back to basically flat year on year for the most recent week. U.S. import bookings is something that surprised me. You'd think that with all the positive news, whether it's about trade agreements we put in place, exceptions that we're making for certain types of cargo, or what's looking like a potential indication that the Supreme Court might be ruling against these tariffs, we've actually seen a drop in import booking activity in the most recent week. I'd say it looks to be a pretty significant drop, something that we haven't seen in the last month and a half.
Yeah, quite substantial without being able to point to a root cause just yet. And Santosh, feel free to weigh in if you have some insights into why people stopped booking freight to the U.S. a week ago.
I don't probably have anything super profound, but I guess the one thing we could look at here, if you look at the year over year change, is what is a bit startling. Week over week and then year over year, and U.S. China or China to U.S. bookings that you have at the bottom here. Clearly, there's something happening as we kind of look at other alternative trade lanes. And perhaps what is happening is we're seeing things shifting. And because things are shifting, cargo isn't moving because it's no longer moving from its original origin that had, been valid for the last, let's say, decade, 2 decades. It's going somewhere else. Yeah. So maybe we capture a bit of that growth and that volume that would be abnormal come January, February. But I think we're going to touch on some of these things shortly.
And a multi-factor, right? So there certainly has been a shift in freight away from the U.S. from China. There is also not the front loading happening post-election now that we saw last year. And, again, it's difficult to point to a specific thing, but the patterns have very much changed. And so that's 16%. And if you go back a few weeks before that, 6%, 11% down. There's multiple factors, but
I will also say, and I mentioned this on the last episode, that the Chinese New Year is a little bit later in 2026 than it was this year. I think it was early in February of this year. It's going to be a bit later in February. There's typically a surge in bookings that we'll see about 40 to 45 days before the Chinese New Year to get cargo in before that brief holiday break. That surge we saw at the end of last year. So we're almost year over year in comparison to bookings that were placed at the end of 2024. That was a bit of a surge to get cargo in before the Chinese New Year. That's likely now going to be like first or second week of January that we'll see that brief surge.
So we just have a high comp year over year to a large degree.
Now, just a small note as well, and this gets into the booking patterns. Rates have been dropping, especially on the spot market, except most recently this past week, some of the carriers put some GRIs out and tried to recover with 3%, 5% increases. So perhaps this is a little bit of the behavior of the booking parties knowing, like, I don't need to book right now because if I wait 2 or 3 weeks, I'm still going to get it in before Chinese New Year. But I'll be able to take advantage of what's going to be even likely lower rates in 2 to 3 weeks than we see today.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's go into prediction number 1. We've got a few to get through here, and we might actually just use the rest of our time going through our predictions. So walk us through this first one. It seems like this is really a statement about how global trade has shifted from where it was into the paradigm that it is in today, or the paradigm that we're entering into 2026.
Yeah. So for everybody that is kind of digging in week over week, month over month on the soap opera that is U.S.-China relations, it should not be a surprise that at the crux of this are disputes around access to critical resources, right? Critical natural resources, but equally the processing capacity of those resources, that for many key critical minerals, not only do deposits sit in China or towards Asia, but also the processing capability, which I think a lot of people ignore, is also very heavily skewed into China. And over the last several decades, China has used diplomacy as a way to access reserves, even in other regions, right? Latin America, Africa, the Belt Road Initiative has been very critical in that. But they have not shied away from saying, we also want to be able to process these things within our mainland. And that's something over the last 30, 40 years, increasingly the US has said, hey, you know what? As globalization took hold and specialization came back to the top, maybe we shouldn't be the ones doing it. We're friendly towards China, or we're friendlier in under prior administrations and in prior decades. They'll take care of us. But that's really being tested. So if you all can kind of think about the history classes we've all sat through, all great empires, what did they do? They went out and through various means figured out how to get access and ownership of natural resources, and then thought about the processing of them. And I might be also revealing my age, but if you think about games like Civilization, even StarCraft or Minecraft for those who have kids, this is the first thing you usually do when you're trying to kind of build your civilization and your empire. You figure out where the natural resources are and how you can have ownership of them, and then build processing capability behind them. So I think a lot of the narrative is going to be more around minerals, metals, agriculture, energy, and how we're securing all of these elements for the benefit of our respective countries, so to speak.
Well, and not just with what China's doing, but I think you could even say that what's happened in the last week off the coast of Venezuela, and with the tanker, the Iranian tanker that was carrying fuel from China, the U.S. is now also playing by those same rules.
Totally. And I'm a big believer that history may not repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And we all were of an age where we can remember, and we're very kind of, I guess, activated when the U.S. has done versions of this elsewhere in the world, right? Middle East. And so this is not new. But I'll finish this point by reminding everybody that it's something like on the order of 80% of global trade, if you look at physical volumes, are these, raw materials, right? Energy, agriculture, metals, minerals. And that has kind of gone by the wayside because the value sits in more processed and containerized items. But I think you're going to see a flip and dare I say a bit of a balance, because we'll also recognize that these natural resources can also provide leverage when you think about diplomacy, trade lanes, geopolitics, but also inflation, and being a source of inflation that'll then not only increase the cost of goods, but the cost of shipping them as well, because they're an input inside of these shipping organizations.
Great. You heard it here first. Prediction number one. This will be an interesting one. I think it's already starting to come true, but certainly something that it sounds like you think will continue through the rest of next year. So let's go into prediction number two on the same vein of natural resources. This is a little bit of a different take, but explain your thinking here, Santosh.
So we can all align on there's increased scrutiny and belief that we need to have direct access to natural resources. You can no longer rely on an ally that might have been a decade ago, but nothing's going to change meaningfully in the short term, right? And what I mean by that is it takes on average 10 to 20 years if you're to look at a mine or an exploration project for oil, natural gas, to really bring it up to scale and producing. And so I don't think we're going to see anything abnormal or unusual, dare I say, when it comes to the flows of these natural resources in 26 as they have been in 25. If there is a change, that means that there's an alliance or an agreement, a trade agreement that has been struck that did not exist this year or in prior years that has been unlocked next year or in the future. So one can happen, but we're not necessarily going to see kind of the direct result of us perhaps or a lot of developed scaled out economies going on a land grab for natural resource.
Yeah, it's like you could see changes in policy and some of the moves being made, but because of the time it takes for the actual production capacity to be ramped up and these mines and drills and all the resources to be extracted, likely not something that will actually be an impact seen in 2026.
In a world of atoms, change does not happen as it does in a world of bits and bytes.
Yeah, no, I like that one. Okay, so on the topic of products and resources, sounds like this is more of a comment about the types of cargo that are being shipped and what to look for in terms of those leading indicators, or what not to look for.
Yeah. Again, kind of going back to my prior statement, right? The vast majority of volumes in global trade are these natural resource products, but manufactured goods, processed goods, dominate trade value, and therefore they dominate headlines. But there's going to be a greater understanding and recognition that one needs to balance these these two topics, and they're linked, because these inputs are ultimately what ultimately turns into manufactured product, right? And so one cannot necessarily just pay attention to the output and not the input, especially in this day and age where I think it's becoming even more obvious that inflation has reared its head. It's not necessarily going to go away. And so if you see the price of these commodities that are oftentimes dollar denominated and pegged to the dollar in various ways, those prices are going to increase of these inputs. There's going to be knock-on effects. So don't just pay attention to one thing. Pay attention. If you're going to pay attention to one thing, pay attention to the inputs, I think, for the next year.
Yeah. So almost like go more upstream into those raw products, those commodity type products, rather than what would follow downstream in the end consumer goods, or what the products are to actually make. It reminds me of the comment we made about soy exports from the US to China, and the fact that we still haven't seen that bounce back. As a quick view, I actually built that in a chart here in TradeView. So just looking at the bookings placed for soy from the US to China over the last few weeks, still has not bounced back whatsoever from where it was earlier in the year.
Pretty sobering.
Very low volumes. So yeah, definitely a prediction that has been true so far this year, and something that will continue next year. Let's go on to prediction number 4. Okay, nearshoring.
So Mexico has already overtaken China as our largest trading partner in the U.S., right? That happened last year, year prior. But what I believe we're going to start to see increasing signs of is that nearshoring is happening. This takes time. It goes back equally to the similar statement we made around natural resources. This is the physical world. You can't just pick something up and drop it in a new place and it operates per usual. There are entire processes that global supply chain teams have been undertaking since COVID in order to, in that notion, to make their supply chains more resilient and tolerant to faults. But that thread continues, and I think you're going to see for the first time small signs that now trade volumes are permanently shifting away. And I think it was yesterday in the Journal of Commerce, every morning, get their newsletter dropped in my inbox. You're seeing some of this in air, where air volumes have actually dropped from China to the US, but they're emerging elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And it's now happening on a consistent enough basis that, there might be something here. There's capacity that's been built up. There's a qualified supplier base that importers are acknowledging and have blessed. And so we're going to start pulling volumes from there. I think we're going to continue to see some of these early signs into next year. And will be interesting to see kind of where this emerges, right? Southeast Asia, Mexico, Eastern Europe. These are kind of noted or have been said to be the future of where manufacturing might happen. Let's see. 2026 should really be able to tell us whether that's proving out or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So more of a medium confidence here. more to see. We're starting to see some of that emerge, especially with Mexico, like you said. But yeah, we'll see some of those other regions, whether it's Vietnam, Thailand, Europe, start to emerge as those alternatives to China. Okay, prediction number 5. This is a straightforward one. The U.S. trade deficit, a big topic of conversation really all year long, beginning with President Trump taking office, being almost number one in at least in the top 2 or 3 of his priorities with the new administration. Addressing that trade deficit has been the primary focus for the tariffs. Yes, we want to bring in more tariff revenue. Yes, we want to use it to get better trade agreements. But these trade agreements, the end goal of them is to reduce our trade deficit, increase U.S. exports, decrease U.S. imports on a country-by-country basis. You are thinking that will actually widen, that will actually get worse before it gets better into 2026. Why is that?
I think at best it stays flat. If anything, it's going to widen. And for anybody here, I assume kind of most of us have taken Economics 101. Tariffs do not change consumption patterns, right? In a globalized economy, it just changes who you trade with. Now, part of that might be why the administration came out of the gate and we were engaging in tariff talk with nearly everybody. And there's some very kind of distant, remote countries and trade counterparts that faced very high tariff charges relative to our trade volumes with them. But this is not going to be something that improves as a result of trade. Really, what's going to change our trade gap is how much we consume, how much we produce. Production just doesn't get mobilized overnight, right? Takes multiple years. Some of the work we did as far back as 2019, 2020, 21 suggests if you have a greenfield site of production, it'll take you 7 years, usually from a shovel going in the dirt to the first widget coming off the manufacturing site. Mm-hmm. The other levers we might pull, how can we incentivize savings, investment domestically? But I just don't foresee that happening. We haven't seen those pieces get put into motion where they can then generate trade deficit benefits to the U.S. in a matter of the next 12 months. So
I have to say I strongly agree with this one, Santosh. And another factor is not just the U.S. and its own ability to produce or its reliance on consuming goods from overseas, but also U.S. exports, which is the other half of this trade deficit. U.S. exports are not growing. U.S. exports are dependent on the consumer demand from Europe, from China, from Central South America, everywhere else where we're trying to send these goods. So whether we put an agreement in place with Argentina or India or China or Europe, we still have to actually see that demand materialize in U.S. exports increasing, whether it's boosting our automotive industry or boosting our energy exports to some of these regions. We haven't seen that play out, and it's uncertain if we'll even see that impact the trade deficit next year.
Agreed. Well put.
Is there a category of good that the U.S. is leading in growing exports? We have to go do some research. I'm just even wondering aloud, if we were to have goods grow in terms of exports, what goods would those even be from the US?
There's a lot that we would like to see bought more, whether it's pork or soy or some of our own automotive production being able to go to Europe rather than us relying on automotive cars and parts being brought in from Europe. And then energy products. That's really, to me, the main ones. Everything else is minor.
The only thing I'll say before we kind of move on from this point is it almost feels like we're fighting that we're a consumption-based economy. And there's a lot of kind of negatives to that, admittedly, especially when we kind of give up things that are critical to our security and sovereignty as U.S. citizens. But the benefit also is we've demonstrated the resilience of the American consumer. And that's really something that most other economies don't have. And so it very well could be a mistake if we try to flip this entirely. But there is some sensibility in, hey, critical inputs, critical items like chips, batteries, pharmaceuticals. We should have some of that competency domestically in order to secure everybody here in the U.S.
Yeah. All right. 5 more predictions. Number 6. Let's talk about safety stock, Santosh.
So, man, we saw this happen through COVID, right? We all went shelter in place in our consumer lives. We ended up doing what could be described as a run on our favorite retailer and having them stock out of things that were otherwise trivial, like toilet paper, so on and so forth. What I believe is we saw a similar run up of inventory ahead of the new tariffs coming online this year. Retailers are quietly trying to work through that. You saw the holiday season expand well into kind of August, September in some cases. The Cyber Monday, Black Friday discounts actually were much longer in duration than we've seen historically. So giving consumers a chance to buy. As a retailer, I'm trying to get inventory off my shelf, but there's going to be a level of write down. Now, this is what happens. But you're going to come into the new year and you still need stock, right? You need to buy inventory in order to sell. It's the lifeblood of your business if you think about a consumer organization. So my belief is, one, you're going to see these consumer businesses again purchase, and it's going to drive and maybe counter some of our historic seasonality we've seen. But industrial end markets as well, a lot of these inputs, again, don't live in the U.S. We don't have this competency around extraction processing. If it's a raw input, or if it's an intermediate item, we're still going to have to import it from somewhere else. So you're going to see, I think, a buildup of stock as well, assuming and under the assumption that things are cheaper today than they are tomorrow, because inflation is a massive concern. And that concern is only going to continue if we get a Federal Reserve that is going to take a tone that is less hawkish and more dovish to inflation, and cut rates as is desired by various institutions across the government.
Absolutely. So it sounds like this is almost, well, and I'm thinking about a lot of the front loading that happened in the first, 4 months of this year up until April or May. Maybe this is a prediction more so for the second half of next year. Or do you think that import pulse, that import surge might even occur earlier?
I think it all comes down to whether those operators of consumer value chains continue to see demand. And demand doesn't kind of wane off right after the holiday period, peak season. They're going to need product in order to sell. Industrial activity has been sideways, although when we look at sentiment data coming out of the trade associations, the vast majority of those executives surveyed, are very optimistic about their prospects for the next 12 months. So if that positive sentiment is going to have to be fulfilled and things need to be manufactured, you might actually see more of that activity in the front half of the year. But I think that's the big unknown, and that's why there's a medium confidence in part here as to when does it happen. I think it's going to happen, but when?
This also ends up being a tailwind prediction number 5 as well.
All right. Prediction number 7, where we're going right after the earnings releases that we've seen come out over the course of the year, all looking generally positive for most ocean carriers. Sounds like you think that will continue. We're not going to see any ocean carriers really suffer financially in 2026.
No, I don't believe so. I think if we were to take this year as a simpleton in their level of profitability this year, I think they're going to just effectively at least solve for that next year, right? What the top 10 liners account for 85% of shipping capacity, something kind of that order. When we talk about this type of industry, there are oligopolistic tendencies in this industry.
Yeah.
And there are many tools like blank sailings, general rate increases that Kyle, you had mentioned GRIs earlier in the segment. These tools can help them protect margin profitability regardless of what is happening kind of around global volumes. So feel very strongly about this.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially when you compare it historically to the dramatic swings, ups and downs, and the recessions that carriers have gone through before. This is nowhere near as bad as even some of those. So they're going to be sticking around for quite some time. Okay, last three predictions here. We're going right into a current war in Europe. Prediction number 8: we think we might actually see peace between Russia and Ukraine next year.
You can call it peace. We could call it a ceasefire, frozen conflict. But in this modern age, right, when you think about inter-country conflict, there's not really been kind of this like outright winner. It always kind of ends up in a kind of a mutual, yeah, we're just going to stop this.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's where we're heading with all of the rhetoric that's coming out of these diplomatic conversations, acknowledging that Russia is still being aggressive and hostile in the front lines. Mm-hmm. But it feels like we're mapping to a point where we just agree to stop this conflict, and there'll be some concessions on both sides.
It definitely sounds like, at least at this point, President Trump has put a lot of his cards into achieving a sort of ceasefire and is ramping up the amount of leverage and pressure he has to the extent he can on either Ukraine to accept certain terms, Russia, let's find a middle ground. Let's go to the rest of the European Union and get them to sort of support these terms. That's definitely been ramping up. And so considering that's already started now, I'm with you. I think we'll see some sort of ceasefire. We'll see how long it lasts, but we'll see some sort of pause, at least in the conflict next year.
Agree.
All right, last two predictions. Let's shift our regional focus for foreign policy over to the South China Sea. We think that will ramp up, but not ramp up dramatically.
So if we look at the Pacific theater and specifically the South China Sea, it's something like a third of global trade transits this body of water. There are not a lot of economic incentives for either side to escalate. That does not mean that there won't be increased hostility, right? You can have increased hostility without necessarily all-out war. And if you're to also look at modern warfare, and there are numerous books like the Pacific, Chips, so on and so forth, warfare itself might also be going in a different direction where it's more cyber-oriented than confrontational. You have two world powers that equally have that ability to wage cyber warfare in order to avoid something so outright confrontational. So
you also have the middle power players starting to gear up more, between Japan, Vietnam actually going about and installing some of their own islands, newly created islands in the South China Sea now as well. So where before it may have been more the U.S. led what's going on here in the South China Sea, it's going to be more of the other players, I think, exerting a bit more of their pressure that they can.
So we will begin to see that sort of ramp up, but at least for next year, nothing escalating into what we would traditionally think of as an actual war or conflict directly.
Yeah.
Okay. And last prediction for next year. Let's talk about oil. Let's talk about Venezuela. This is interesting because we were just talking about this, I think it was 2 weeks ago. And what's happened over the last 2 weeks seems to, this is already happening, right?
So I went away and dug into a little more data in order to really understand what Venezuela has. Venezuela, if you look at kind of all historic studies around oil deposits, comes up at the top. And they have nearly 20% of global oil reserves in Venezuela. That might shock a few folks. But what is equally interesting, and I didn't realize this, is that the type of crude oil that Venezuela has, right, is actually extremely compatible with the refining capability of what we've set up here in the US. It's very similar to the type of crude that comes out of the ground here.
Yeah.
And I believe they call that heavy crude.
Well, and also we in the US built an amazing amount of infrastructure in the Gulf during the 90s and aughts because we had a better relationship with Chavez, et cetera. And we built out the infrastructure required to process that. Well, like other players in the Western Hemisphere do not have that infrastructure even.
Spot on. And it kind of goes back to the earlier statement, right? It's not just about access, or rather, let's talk about it, ownership of these reserves, regardless of what we're talking about. You also need the processing. And that's something that's hard to ignore or say we don't have in the US. We can process heavy crude. And so the one thing that in prior years, dare I say decades, we've ignored is that Venezuela has ignored a lot of the sanctions and has continued to use these shadow fleets of tankers in order to use their key asset, which is oil, in order to maintain some stability in their economy, right? And a lot of their counterparts, I think, Ben, you mentioned Iran earlier, right? These are countries that also align with Russia. So on the prior statement around how can we take and up the ante and the pressure on Russia to come to the table, well, that's one of the beautiful things about global trade. You could figure out who your counterparties are and how you might exert pressure on them. But it is very, very, very hard to ignore that this might all be about, going back to my earlier statement, getting access and increased access to critical resources. And the thing we're in the US facing is we're seeing historic demand for compute, and that has created a data center boom and a CapEx boom we haven't seen like any other since maybe the first industrial revolution. But with that is we are energy starved. Most data center operators and construction firms, as we engage with them, are saying, hey, we actually believe nat gas turbines are part of the answer. And so we're, I think, going in a world where we're realizing we're going to consume energy like we have not consumed in decades. How do we shore ourselves up? Because it's going to take a while for nuclear, hydrogen, these alternatives to come online.
We'll have a production deficit for a decade to 2 decades potentially before the next generation of energy production comes online, whether you want to say that is, cold fusion or something else. But yeah, there's no answer other than petro.
That's right.
Into 15 years.
So ultimately, this prediction is really about we will see some sort of agreement between the U.S. and Venezuela specifically, which gives us kind of what we're after, which is more access to their oil reserves.
Yep.
All right. Well, I don't see.
And it's not just from the perspective of like we have the infrastructure to process it. Venezuela, let's say there's a future where Venezuela works well with the U.S. around energy production, et cetera. I don't know if there's a path for Venezuela other than major regime change, because you also have to look at the massive amount of brain drain that happened with Venezuela. So like when they privatized many of the oil companies in Venezuela for the export, you actually lost a lot of the capability and facility to function as an industry the way they once were. So all of that has to be put back into place somehow, because it's still not there right now. And hence why it's like exporting heavy, dirty oil on stealthy fleets is like the path they have going forward, and selling it for pennies on the dollar type of scenario.
Unrefined and all of that. Yeah. No, that's a great point. Well, I was going to say, I don't see any disagreements, certainly not on our side. We're all in alignment on these predictions, and I don't see any in the comments. Thank you to the audience for staying a few minutes extra, hearing the predictions. Santosh, thank you for joining us. This was great.
Thanks for having me.
A lot of fun. And we'll meet back here in a year and see how all these predictions played out.
Let's do it.
Well, happy holidays to the rest of you. We'll see you again in 2026.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.